Hello, everyone. This is a lecture for Open Campus of Meiji University School of Global Japanese Studies. Okay, I would like to start with introducing my lecture, which is titled Global Transformation, Globalization, and its Impact on the Global Community. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Svetlana VASSILIOUK. If you were to ask me where I'm from, well, this is a very simple question, but in my case, my answer may be somewhat complicated. And that's exactly why I decided to include a map of Russia today, and it also includes the former Soviet republics nearby. I'm originally from Ukraine. I was born in Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula right here. And at that time, it was one country, the Soviet Union. Because of my father's work, my family and we actually traveled a lot around Ukraine as well as around Russia. So we got to live in a place called the Arctic Circle in the city of Norilsk, which is not too far from the North Pole, as you can see here. We also live not too far from Japan in the region called the Sakhalin region. We lived in a city called Holmsk, former Japanese port of Maoka. Not so far from Japan, actually the two islands of Hokkaido and Sakhalin are separated only by 40 kilometers. And from here, we moved to Moscow, where we lived for about 2 years before immigrating to the United States of America. Once we settled in the United States, we lived in Florida, and this is what I continue calling my home state. My hometown today is actually Miami, Florida. But to pursue my graduate studies, I moved to Washington, D.C., where I was studying international relations and international economics, focusing on Japan at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. After that, I moved to Tokyo, Japan, which took place almost 20 years now. So since then, I've been living, working, and enjoying my life as much as I can in this beautiful country of Japan. I joined the faculty of School of Global Japanese Studies at Meiji University in 2011. So it's been slightly over 10 years. Since I started teaching various courses, my main area is international relations. As you can see here, here's the list of my classes that I taught at Meiji University School of Global Japanese Studies. In addition to international relations, I also teach classes on Japanese politics, a couple of seminars on Russia, today introducing Russian history, political, economic, social systems, as well as Russian foreign relations, focusing on Asia and the rest of the global community. Starting from the next academic year, this course will be transferred and changed and will be called Russia and Eurasia to include nearby former Soviet republics, including my native Ukraine, and also a wider region of Eurasia. I also teach seminars on Japanese foreign relations, and at one point I was teaching a class on Introduction to Global Japanese Studies. All of my classes are taught in the English language. For your information, I also included a small note on my short note on my education. As you can see, it's reflecting my international background. I have degrees from both Japan and the United States, and also my areas of expertise and research. My current research is actually focusing on a role of Russia in the wider Arctic region. I also continue to follow Japanese-Russian relations, which was the focus of my doctorate dissertation at Hosei University. So anything related to Russia and Japan, plus their bilateral relationship, is something that I continue watching very closely. All right, let me introduce the contents and the flow of my class for you today. I would like to begin by introducing the importance of studying international relations and world politics. I abbreviate those two interrelated subjects as the IR, international relations, and WP, world politics. Then I would like for you to take a look at and introduce the several categories of very important global events and developments. We put them in a category, for example, of GTEs, global transforming events, and GAIs, global agenda issues. After that, I would like to talk a little bit about the topic of globalization, focusing on its definitions, major aspects, but also will introduce to you samples of various risks associated with globalization today. And my last point of the lecture today will be maybe looking into the future a little bit and trying to figure out what awaits us as a global community undergoing this rapid change of turning our global society into a more interconnected one, or perhaps we may face more disintegration and fragmentation in the future. So I would like to finish my class today with looking into the impact of globalization on the world order and its future possible trends. Okay, it goes without saying that it's important for us to follow the ongoing news and events. As a matter of fact, every single day you turn on your TV or you're looking at your smart devices, your smartphone, you will see that there is a constant bombardment of various news. Some of them are breaking, others are less important, but we're really dealing with a huge, enormous amount of information coming towards us. How to make sense of it? How can we explain the ongoing various developments, conflicts, trends around the globe, and how we can possibly predict the future development in international relations and world politics? Well, in order to answer this question, first we have to have a thorough, good understanding of history, particularly the history of international relations. Let me introduce a famous quote by Spanish political scientist and philosopher George Santayana, who famously said that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, which means that if we do not study the past, we will most likely make the same mistakes, or we most likely run into same troubles in the future. So in order for us to have a better understanding, better grasp of what's going on with our world today, and to avoid possible conflicts in the future, we have to learn from history. It's a first point. The second point is that we cannot really separate what is going on in one particular country, one particular region from the rest of the global community. Why? Because so many ongoing global trends, they are affecting us as one connected global community of almost 8 billion people residing on this planet. We are all part of this world. We are all connected. What's happening in our individual nations, especially if our nations are great powers, having great influence on global arena, it will likely affect all of us one way or another. Exactly because of this interconnectedness, we need to be more aware of what's going on in our world today. What can we learn? How we can avoid making the same mistakes, especially on major conflicts in the future. However, we're dealing with a major challenge when we're studying international relations or world politics, or actually any aspect of social science for that matter. Why? Because we're looking not at the natural exact science with a certain matter of precision. No, we're dealing with the human nature. And every single human being in our global community of nearly 8 billion people, we have our own perceptions, views, ideas, as well as our own stereotypes, biases, misperceptions about each other, about how the world operates, about how to interpret certain news and developments. In other words, we are dealing with human nature, and we have to consider so many factors that influence our behavior, our relations with one another, and that, of course, projects on the same level of relations among the global actors, the countries, the non-state actors, various institutions, etc., etc. And to make it even more complicated for us, another challenge of studying international relations is, of course, dealing with enormous amount of information every single day. New developments, ongoing news in various areas and sectors of our life. It can be quite overwhelming and difficult, but don't despair. There are ways and tools to try to make sense of what is going on in our world today, and even to make possible predictions about the future. First of all, let me introduce a category of very important events and developments, the ones that we should pay a particular attention to in our study of international relations. This category is called the GTEs, Global Transforming Events. The key word here is transforming. Something is happening that it's in a major qualitative way, is changing the way we look at the world, is changing the way how we relate to each other. It's creating a sense of a completely new era, a new epoch is about to start in international relations. So these global transforming events, they really mark a beginning of a new phase in our history. They sometimes mark a breaking point, and that's why we can call them shake-up events, jolting events, almost an earthquake-like events that shake our existing world order to its core and marking a new beginning, a new era in international relations. To give you some examples of such GTEs from recent history, I included several. And as you can see, quite a few of them, at least the first, we can say 3 or arguably 4, coming at the end of major wars or conflicts. For example, the first event is August 6th of 1945, which marks the beginning of a nuclear age, because on this very day, the American military forces dropped the very first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, resulting in death and destruction. We're talking about tens of thousands of casualties right there on this very day. And in its aftermath, tens of thousands, if not millions, of people whose health was affected by the fallout from this enormous disaster. This was meant to bring a quicker ending to the Pacific War, World War II, where the United States was facing the Imperial Japan. But also it was an opportunity for the American government to test their extremely dangerous, deadly, very advanced new technology, a new weapon called the atomic bomb, which they effectively did. From this point on, we can argue that our world is no longer safe, because from this point on, we see the beginning of the arms race, focusing on the possession, acquisition, and development of nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union will catch up very quickly with the United States when in 1949, they developed their own atomic bomb. And then we see gradually the number of the states in possession of nuclear weaponry begins to grow. Currently, today, we have more than 13,000 nuclear weapons available in possession of 9 countries. And we should be probably afraid that that number of both nuclear weapons and the number of the countries that have nuclear weapons may grow, which would result in a problem of nuclear proliferation. That's the first date, the GTE, which you can see is definitely breaking our human history into a distinct new era. It's starting a new epoch where we no longer can be completely safe as long as we have such a large number of extremely deadly weaponry available around the globe. The other two dates are somewhat related. They come at the end of another next global conflict called the Cold War, where we were looking at the ideological standoff, strategic standoff between the two poles of power, we can say, the Soviet Union and the United States. That's why we call the world order around this time during this conflict bipolar world order. Bipolar, two poles, two centers of power, two superpowers facing off each other, the Soviet Union and the United States. But towards the end of the 1980s, and as you can see here, specifically on November 9th, 1989, we see the first sign that the Cold War is nearing its end. First, because of the dismantling of the Berlin Wall, dividing East and West Germany. And next year, we will see the reunification of these two countries. And a year later, in December 1991, we see the breakup and the demise of one of those poles, centers of power in this bipolar competition. The Soviet Union ceased to exist, and we have only one superpower, very important, very powerful nation still standing, which is the United States, marking the beginning of what we call the US-led unipolar world order. So as you can see, again, this particular GTE serves as a beginning, marking a new era in international relations. For the United States, unfortunately, we call it a unipolar moment, not exactly unipolar era or phase. Why? Because comes the next GTE on September 11 of 2001, which marks the new age of terrorism, turning itself into a global force, global actor. And it also undermines the role of the United States as the only powerful nation capable to face this very elusive yet powerful threat. So the unipolar moment for the United States ceased to exist within a decade. And from this moment on, we see that the United States is vulnerable to global threat of terrorism. Furthermore, it needs to start building the coalitions around the globe to deal with this very pressing problem in its ongoing war against terror, collectively with other important, powerful nations. The other two GTEs that are included in my slide here are as of very recent history. This one here on November 8, 2016, plus January 20th of 2017. These 2 days apply to first the election and then the inauguration of former President Donald Trump in the United States. And with that, we can call it perhaps the new era in international relations. I put a question mark because we need a little bit more time to put a proper judgment of history on the impact of Trump's presidency in international relations. But we can already see the first seeds of the birth of Trumpism, its influence around the world with the rise of populist, nationalistic, inward-looking governments, the spread of disinformation, alternative truths, falsehoods, and at the same time resulting in basically a decline of the United States global leadership. I also keep this question mark here because it's quite possible that someone like Mr. Trump or even Trump himself may still come back and become the president of the United States of America in the near future again. It's possible to envision that. And then we will once again be witnessing the decline of American global leadership, of the involvement of the United States in various global agenda issues that I will introduce to you on the next page. And last but not least is a very disturbing date, which is I personally feel devastated by. It is the beginning of yet another conflict. We can call it a war between Russia and Ukraine that began on February the 24th of this year. It's not exactly something new or totally unexpected. We can call it the Ukraine crisis 2.0 because the other crisis in Ukraine began in 2014 when Russia annexed my native Crimean Peninsula where I was born. It became the Russian territory and it was involved in a protection and various military activities allegedly in the east of Ukraine called Donbass. As a result, Russia was placed under various sanctions by the United States and the rest of the Western nations. And in a sense, the current war is a continuation of that first Ukraine crisis. But we can see that there is definitely a wider and ongoing confrontation between Russia and the NATO as a Western security bloc, between Russia and the rest of the West, which is quickly turning into what we can also refer to as the Cold War 2.0, another renewed Cold War. Well, these are just some examples of GTEs, but again, we should pay attention to such events because they indeed mark a new beginning, maybe a different way of looking at how the world works, functions, has a prominent impact on the global order. And we have many other important events and developments that continue shaping our world today. Another category of them is the global agenda issues. GAIs, the issues that, of course, are happening in various regions and nations, but they have the global consequences, the global impact. So they are affecting our global community of nearly 8 billion people. They do have a profound influence on maybe our political systems, security systems, on economic system, etc., etc. So depending on their urgency, on their reach and their scale, we can divide them roughly into these two categories that I lined up for you here. One is the high politics, GAIs, and another one is the low politics, GAIs. I included some examples for you, but you can see that the high politics category usually deals with the issues that require an urgent and immediate attention of our global community. They are about our survival as the human species, as the human race. They are the highest priority issues that placed at the top of the agenda in various meetings, such as the United Nations Security Council, or such important gatherings as the G7 or the G20 and all other major security summits. The other category, we call it low politics category of GAIs. That means that we are still looking very importantly at the issues or problems facing the world today, but we can take our time discussing them, negotiating various solutions, looking for the most effective ways to settle and resolve those problems. They are, for example, the issues related to economic crisis, inequality, demographic issues, environmental problems, the pandemics, etc., etc. Yes, they are all extremely important, but again, This is not something that it's affecting our immediate survival as such. So they are introduced on the agenda of various meetings as well, such as G7, G20, plus the World Economic Forum that takes place in Switzerland, Davos, on a yearly basis. The COP is the global, it's called Conference of the Parties, global meeting focusing on the environmental issues, climate crisis issues, and other global and regional gatherings. But usually in our study of international relations, or in our study of the history of relations among the global great powers, we focus on the study of the high politics, GAIs, as much as possible. Again, it's about our survival, it's about war and peace, it's about our human security, national security, and various conflicts associated with that. Right, let me move to the next topic of my lecture today. It's about globalization. As I already introduced you, we are all connected one way or another in this very complex, sometimes complicated and exciting community of nearly 8 billion people. We are witnessing unprecedented level of what we call interconnectedness among us. But it's not only about people, it's interconnectedness of markets, places, destinations, interconnectedness of various business opportunities. And that's what globalization is basically all about, turning our world into a one interconnected, integrated community. So the basic definition is listed here. It's basically about the growing interconnectedness of people and places, and we're looking at the converging three processes of economic, political, and social or cultural change. And by the way, these are the same three categories or three directions of globalization that we will be discussing later today. So first of all, how did globalization come about? If we track its early history, it will likely be related to the developmental or phase in capitalism, capitalist economies, the age of exploration, overproduction, looking for opportunities outside of our domestic markets. And that's what led to this need to leave your individual nations or regions and to look for opportunities for business, for labor, for trade outside of our intermediate areas. So interconnected global economy is actually producing enormous positive benefits for all of us, would tell us the pro-globalization economists. And I'm introducing two of them for you here. One is a Swedish economist and political scientist we can call Johan Nornberg, who strongly believes that globalization is a positive phenomena. It leads to a growing prosperity for all. We will all benefit from our interconnected opportunities in trade, commerce, production, etc. Another scholar, an American scholar, Gadish Bhavati, actually believes that in spite of having various risks and maybe shortcomings, our world actually needs more globalization, not less. It doesn't need to be tamed. Let it grow, let globalization turn our global community more into an interconnected place for all of us, from which we can all benefit. Another interesting definition comes from a famous American writer and columnist, Thomas Friedman, who wrote this famous book on globalization, and he pronounced to us that the world is actually flat, looking into a brief history of the 21st century and globalization with that. What did he mean by telling us that the world has gone from round to flat? The notion of the flat world usually applies to our perception of sameness. Everybody has same, equal, great opportunities across the globe. We are dealing with a global community where we can enjoy what we call a level playing field. In spite of our individual differences, we can spread our know-how, various ideas and opportunities, but at the same time, we leaning towards creating a world that run on universal standards. We see a lot of sameness, similar consumer behavior, similar standards in how we do business with each other, even how we communicate with each other. So perhaps it leads to the loss of diversity. So that could be another interpretation of a flat world that globalization has allegedly created. And the last definition of the economic globalization that I'm introducing to you comes from the IMF, International Monetary Fund. It's about, again, the keyword is integration, but we're looking at economies that become interconnected across the world through the movement of goods, services, and capital across the individual borders. All right, very quickly, I would like to introduce to you, I already mentioned that globalization is shaping our world in the three distinct directions. In addition to the economic aspect here, which I already covered, there are two other. They are political and social or cultural. In its political direction, we're looking how globalization is helping us share common understanding, common set of ethical principles and political values. But with that, there is also growing perception that our states may be losing their significance and to a certain degree, their sovereignty, their full independence, their even meaning in international relations. The very reason of their existence may be under threat. And in the meantime, if we're looking at the emerging new mentality of the people around the globe, we can raise this issue of, or rather, new phenomenon of global citizenry, especially because of our successful efforts to create an effective global governing institutions, such as the United Nations, which launched this very project on global citizenship education, as well as G20, G7, and other global governance institutions that helping propel the spread of the political globalization around the world. Basically, it's the notion about us as one community of people sharing one earth, one atmosphere, one economy, and therefore we have responsibilities to each other to preserve this very planet that we share with each other. So global values, ethic, global citizenry, the spread of common political values. In its social or cultural dimension, we're looking at the spread of global migration, movement of people across the globe, including global travel, including the spread of mass culture. And with that, it could lead to certain tensions, such as globalization versus localization, or homogenization, which means the spread of sameness. Very similar way we dress, we eat, we communicate, we educate ourselves, what we like to consume as consumers in a given economy, that seems to be influenced by the spread of the mass culture. And to resist that, maybe we should focus more on the local content. That's why it's called localization. But if it's difficult to completely get rid of the influence of the Western or American culture, why not to hybridize it? Why not to combine it with the elements of our traditional culture? And that's what we call it hybridization. Exactly because we would like to avoid the sameness or similarity to other cultures. We would like to retain our unique character as a culture, as a nation. Social dimension of globalization is also about the so-called shrinking world phenomena, where we no longer divided by this great, sense of distances, separating us from each other, exactly because we enjoy the IT, communication revolution, social networks helping us to stay in touch in spite of the differences separating us across the globe. So once again, the three important directions of globalization: economic, political, and social or cultural. As I already mentioned earlier, we should not forget that globalization is not only producing wonderful benefits and winners on the global stage, it also leads to various risks and maybe producing some inequalities, and in some cases more than in others, especially in its economic direction. We can see that there is a still widening gap between the advanced and rich nations of the global north, or the least developed or developing nations in the so-called global south. Or we're looking at this perception of the growing risk, shared risk, when it comes to economic or financial crisis. If such a crisis happens in a major economy, it will definitely have repercussions and impact on the rest of the global community. And that's unfortunately what comes with the economic globalization. Other examples of controversies and risks in the political area, for example, is also a spread of undemocratic, populist, or isolationist and protectionist values, instead of the values that would help us build one community for all. We also see the increase of instability, global crime, and, as I mentioned already, global terrorist activities across the globe, because these criminal elements in our global society are using exactly the same tools available to them as they are available to us through globalization. In social dimension, we're dealing with, for example, migration issues. They may not necessarily lead to the positive outcomes for people seeking shelter, better economic opportunities, or political asylum and escape from their troubles. Sometimes we're dealing with enormous, large-scale refugee crisis across the globe, or large-scale illegal immigration. I already mentioned to you a perception of losing our identity and uniqueness because we are subjected to the mass culture, or the, we can say, exposure to the American and Western culture. At the same time, our local culture and traditions may suffer trying to keep up with the appeal of this mass consumer culture. We're also dealing with a number of various environmental challenges. The pandemics, such as the current one related to the COVID-19. As we know, people travel across the globe, so do the viruses and pandemic disease. Again, globalization can be a caveat or behind the spread of these risks and problems. So what can we do about it? Well, first of all, let us remember that globalization is here to stay. It is an unstoppable process. It will lead to further interconnectedness, integration of our global community in those three directions. However, as a global community and every single state in that community, we have a shared responsibility to make sure that those risks, problems, and other issues associated with globalization would be managed and resolved effectively. All right. At the same time, we would like to see the further spread of common understanding, cosmopolitan values involved in our advance of this new concept called the global citizenship concept, so that we will strive to create a more peaceful, cooperative, and prosperous world for everyone on this planet, regardless of where we come from. And just to give you further evidence about the future of globalization looking rather positive than negative is these two graphs that I'm introducing to you. The first one is basically we can see the continuing upward development and spread of globalization broken into its three categories: economic, social, and political. If we look at the past several decades, going back to the 1980s, you see the lines are going up, telling us that we are indeed becoming more interconnected and globalization is moving further. It's not diminishing. Its spread maybe not as rapid, related to several economic crises and financial crisis, or maybe military conflicts that we've been dealing with. But otherwise, it's a clear upward trend, telling us that we likely expect this in the future as well. The second graph that I'm introducing to you here is related to the KOF Index of Globalization, KOF, that has been developed by a research institute, the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, in Switzerland, where they are tracking the individual nations' performance in various categories, like economic, social, and political interdependence, their connectivity to the world, to get the feeling where they stand in terms of their globalization efforts. So each nation is giving a KOF index of globalization on the scale from 0 to 100. And the higher the value is, the more integrated that nation is with the rest of the global community, the more globalized they are. So you can see that Japan is slightly above the middle, but below a smaller country, smaller economy, such as Romania, for example. Below the United States and its effort of globalization, but above China and India, the other great powers and the most populated, right? The largest nations in terms of the population. So this is a very good source if you would like to track the performance of an individual nation. And there are 207 countries and entities that they have been studying since 1990. To measure their levels of interconnectedness to the rest of the world. And they have individual scores giving for their political, economic, and social globalization. So I would like to conclude with trying to figure out what awaits us in the future in terms of how can we, and if we can really succeed to create a so-called borderless global village, a common home which we can enjoy in spite of our individual differences, where we come from, what nations we represent. Is it really possible to envision that type of a future? Stateless global village. It's hard to give you a definite answer. I would like to believe that perhaps the answer would be a yes in the maybe distant future, but not at this stage, not just yet, because we're still witnessing this interplay, this dynamics between the integrative forces that bringing us together, connecting us further, but at the same time, there is a lot of evidence of the opposite, the separatist or fragmentation movement and forces shaping our world today as well. And some examples I'm including here. Most notable, of course, is the Brexit, when the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union. In not so recent history, we saw the dissolution and fragmentation of Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union. Some trade agreements fell apart. Some nations, important nations, would leave them. Maybe not exactly we at the stage where our individual states don't matter anymore, where it doesn't matter where we're coming from. So there is still very important and significant forces of nationalism and separatism shaping our global community today. But at the same time, we see a strong pull towards creating more unity in our global community, especially because we're dealing with so many GAI's global agenda issues that cannot be dealt with effectively by individual states. We're all in this together, and we have to have common understanding, common responsibility for this entire global community. And that's what drives these integrative forces. So we see, for example, a possibility of further enlargement of the EU or the NATO security bloc. We see more and more trade and security agreements and pacts. I give you some examples here. So it's really hard to tell, but would be great to envision the world in which we all come together and share and preserve it for the future generations. So this is the end of my lecture today. Thank you so much for your attention. I included some references for your review. The first is the textbook that I include and use in my international relations class. Then a quick reference, it's an Oxford Dictionary of Politics, and the 2 internet sources that I already introduced to you in my lecture. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope to see you on our campus at the School of Global Japanese Studies of Meiji University. All the very best to you. Goodbye.